Good morning and welcome to Business Day Dialogues Live in association with Konrad Adenauer Foundation and Ecumenical Foundation of Southern Africa. It is my pleasure to once again welcome you to this second session, the second in a series of dialogues that we've been going to have. And this morning, we are discussing the topic of grassroots governance and accountability. How do we build honest and ethical and effective grassroots level leadership in South Africa? And we've got an able panel who are going to take us through this very important discussion. But before we get into the panel discussion, I want to introduce myself. My name is Nompumelelo Runji, and I'm going to be your MC this morning. And to get us started, to set the scene, I want to invite Dr. René Kuchelenberg, Executive Director at the Ecumenical Foundation of Southern Africa. And he's just going to come on to explain to us why this dialogue is so important for us to be having at this time. Welcome, René.
Good morning, Nompumelelo. It's a pleasure to be here again. And just one word background about the Ecumenical Institute. Firstly, we have something in common with the Konrad Adenauer Foundation, our partner in many programs on building a stronger democracy in South Africa. In a sense, our institute originated also from the example of the German church academies and the public role they play in society after the Second World War. And secondly, our roots traces back to the leadership of Dr. Beyers Naudé, who used to found the Christian Institute, also reflecting on the role of faith communities in society. So these are our roots and also the rationale why we and the Konrad Adenauer Foundation have a strong tradition of cooperating to strengthen democracy and to reflect on the challenges in our society. Going back to the previous one, the first one, where we reflected on the whole political crisis and inequality and poverty, several of the speakers identified leadership, good leadership, as a key challenge we're facing. And I know that today we will focus on how do we restore the deficit of trust that exists between people and political parties, between people and institutions. It's therefore very appropriate to read the latest contribution of former Deputy Minister of Finance, Mtsebisi Jonas, today, where he wrote an article reflecting on the Zondo Commission, and where he concluded by saying, civil society has to set a new agenda for South Africa. And then probably, we hope, political parties will follow. I know that's a tall order for us, but that's the background for today, which makes it extremely relevant to analyze and break down what is really needed in terms of quality of leadership, but also in terms of more than just the values that plays a role. What are the strategies and other issues also involved to rebuild the trust we need desperately to create a new vision for South Africa? So from our side, as an ecumenical network working with faith and church leaders, we are really very proud to be part of this with you and look forward to today's discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, René, for helping to set the scene there. And this is actually a very important conversation that we're having. And before I also give some opening remarks, I just want to introduce the panel this morning. We've got Rev Jerry Pillage, who is the Dean of the Faculty of Theology and Religion at the University of Pretoria. We've also got Professor Jaap de Visser, who is the Director of the Dula Omar Institute and Professor of Law at the University of the Western Cape. And then we're also joined by Professor Thuli Madonsela, who is at the Law Faculty, who's the Law Faculty Trust Chair in Social Justice at Stellenbosch University. I'm not going to say too much about our panelists. I think their reputations precede them. I just want to take a leaf from what René just said. Failures of leadership result in political instability. They foment conflict in society, and have a tendency of producing bad governance, which in turn exacerbates poverty and deepens inequality. Now, in the first dialogue session, which we had last week, we attempted to unpack and we spoke extensively about these issues in an attempt to identify the ingredients that are necessary for constructing a socially cohesive society. And just as Renee mentioned, the thing that really stood out from the conversation that every single panelist mentioned was the importance of leadership, 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 leadership. And so in this dialogue, that's what we're going to focus on. This is what we're going to try and unpack as we try to understand how to restore trust in our society. And of course, these are multi-stakeholder conversations and civil society is taking the lead. I'm going to give each of our panelists about a minute or so just to share their opening reflections on this topic. And then we will continue with the discussion. I'm going to start with you, Professor Madonsela, and just ask you just to give us your thoughts, your preliminary thoughts on this issue. Prof, please unmute.
Thank you, Nampumelelo. Thank you to the Business Day and the Konrad Adenauer Foundation. If there ever was a time when civil society needs to step up and be part of the greater conversation about anchoring, supporting, and preserving democracy, this is the time. And it's a global challenge. It may well be that ours is much more difficult a time than many other countries, but just saving democracy is a global challenge. Civil society needs to dialogue about that. And I do agree with what Prof. Ochlenberg has said about leadership being at the core of that. But leadership has always been there. I mean, I will say to you that Hitler was a leader, Stalin was a leader, and therefore we need to look at what kind of leadership has brought us here and what kind of leadership will take us to the place where we want to be. For example, in South Africa, we have a constitution that says we should go to 3 places. A place where there is democratic governance, social justice, and fundamental human rights for all. That's in the preamble where it says we're adopting this constitution to heal the divisions of the past so as to establish a society that is based on democratic values, social justice, and fundamental human rights, where everyone's potential is freed and everyone's life is improved within the context of the rule of law. And we need leadership that could do that. At Stellenbosch University, we think that that kind of leadership needs to firstly understand the Constitution. In any country, please understand the Constitution. And one of the projects we've initiated, you will be seeing a cartoon with a face, and his or her name is Loli, that will be talking about everyday justice, just starting with understanding the Constitution. And we're doing this as part of a broader Marshall Plan on social justice. At the Tuma Foundation, on the other hand, we've been going through democracy conversations since 2017 because we found that a whole lot of young people and a whole lot of poor people are rejecting democracy. Me and you know there's nothing wrong with democracy. There's something wrong with how we are articulating democracy today. And because democracy has plasticity enough to be molded to meet the needs of any phase of society. And we've been conversing with young people about what is democracy, which is just really people's power. And how can you make democracy work for you? And at Tuma Foundation, we have demologues, which is democracy dialogue, similar to this, but less frequently than this kind of conversation. We also have something called enterprising communities, where we bring government leaders to the community, among other things, to come and explain where's the democracy dividend for this community. And this would be issues such as health, security, and other things. And the third thing is training young people in particular on something called epic leadership. That is leadership that is ethical, purpose-driven, impact-conscious, and committed to serve. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Prof. Madonsela. I'm going to give over to Prof. Defisa to give his opening remarks as well.
Thank you very much, Nompumelelo, and thanks very much to Cass and Business Day for hosting us, and good morning also to my fellow panelists and everyone that's joining us. So, yeah, I think talking about leadership and integrity is such an important theme, and I think it's been stressed correctly so and introduced. And obviously we're going into the silly season of local government elections. And when we talk about grassroots governance, we cannot but talk about what's happening at local government level. And there are so many leadership problems in local government. I'm not one to be joining the cynic commentators that everything is doom and gloom in local governance and grassroots governance. A lot of good stories as well, but it's clear that we have deep problems in our local government system. And something very important happened a few days ago, namely that all the candidates were submitted to the IEC. So basically, that means the die is cast to some extent. All our future leaders in local government are actually on that database with the IEC right now, in terms of the party lists and the candidates. So this is our future leadership at local government level. I think it's actually a fundamental point that had happened a few days ago. So now the next step is for the voters to make that choice. Who of those leaders are going to be elected into these municipal councils where we know there are so many problems? And there are many points I want to make about accountability in local governments, but I think it will come out perhaps in a discussion. But the one point I want to make about these elections, about leadership and integrity and accountability, is that we have to ask the question, how will our voters exercise their choice, and how does democracy work? When you go to the voting booth for local government elections, do you make your choice based on how nicely the national party leader talks, or how much you hate the other party, or what kind of mythical feelings you have towards your own party that you feel aligned to? Or are you making your choice based on how does my municipality where I live, how has it performed over the last 5 years? Have they delivered, and have they delivered equitably? Or have they stolen money? And in my view, we need to have a discussion that we encourage voters to make the choice based on the latter. And if we start making a choice in our democratic functioning based on performance and on local accountability, rather than on broad allegiance. And I think that will be an important step forward, in addition to all the other, I think, discussions we need to have about leadership, etc. Thanks, Nompumelelo.
I'm going to invite Rev Jerry Pillage to lay his thoughts on the table. Thank you so much, Prof. Defisa.
Thank you, and thank you for the opportunity to be part of this panel, and also greetings to our viewers. Well, let me say, from a religious point of view, the issue of state and church has always been under spotlight. It does not matter about your views or even differing perspectives from churches to other religious bodies. About church and state, there's one thing that we all agree and are in common with in terms of our views, and that is that the world belongs to God. God is the creator of all creation. If this much is true, then all creation is under divine scrutiny, judgment, and accountability. All world leaders, governments, countries, and people are called to serve the ends or the will of God in enabling just, sustainable, and a peaceful world. Accountability requires responsible management of all the resources given to us on earth. The biblical word for this is stewardship. Stewardship calls for healthy balances that speaks of caring for the earth and its resources, of ensuring that there is enough for everyone to live and for the generations that follow. Stewardship is not about dominance, plundering, abuse of power and resources, and self-gain. It is a call for servant leadership rather than dictatorship and dominance. It is about serving the needs of the poor, the sick and the needy, the vulnerable and marginalized in society. It is about putting the interest of others above your self-interest. Now, South Africa, I don't want to be negative, but South Africa is very much in a very messy situation. And that I would like to contend is because we do not have strong ethical and moral leaders in the various intersections of society, be it in government, in business, in labor, and even in religion, religious and civil society. Our country's mess can be seen in state capture, in corruption at all levels, recent unrest and looting, the threat to our constitutional democracy, the recent challenges that we face with regards to legal cases against government, where even those who have been responsible to actually formulate the constitution and laws in the country are now wanting to make a mockery of the rule of law. And from a religious point of view, the commercialization of religion and the dangers of the prosperity gospel, to name a few, all actually creates a society that has become destabilized. But in the context of this deficit of leadership and ethical leadership at it, what can we do? Just one or two quick words before I stop. Firstly, good governance requires good moral, ethical leaders. And the government and politicians must set the example. We cannot do it for them. They must take the lead in this area. Secondly, we need to instill and nurture religious and moral values. Integrity, honesty, transparency, and justice must be consciously and visibly seen. Thirdly, we need to implement our strategic policies that we have come up with. And we have them, but we are not implementing them. Policies that speak about and addresses issues of poverty, unemployment, inequalities, gender-based violence, and the youth challenges that we face in our country. We need to, especially down in the grassroots, ensure that there are no more jobs for pals, because that is creating anarchy and destroying our country at different levels. We need right people with the right qualifications and experiences in the right jobs to create a better society where service delivery is done well and where the human development is taken serious consideration into when we are delivering at its best. We also need to instill proper structures of accountability where people are involved in participating in the decision-making processes of the country. But finally, to conclude, we need to build a peaceable community, and the way we need to do that is by working together and seeking to reconcile our nation. Politics and politicians are polarizing and dividing our country and are creating more divides in terms of race and ethnic issues than we've ever seen, notwithstanding the fact of apartheid. But in the new South Africa, that is now 20 years and more, 25 years, we need to have transcended some of these issues. But our leaders who are not demonstrating ethical leadership are creating problems and destroying the beauty of this land. So it's time that we actually woke up and took responsibility to be good, moral, ethical leaders. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Reverend Pillage. I'm going to start with you, as I have been listening to what you're saying, and you're talking about the need for ethical and moral leaders, effective leaders. But I want us to get down to the, what is the anatomy of that kind of leadership? How and where are these kinds of leaders found? Or are they made and shaped? How do they self-identify and self-select, and how can they be selected and nurtured? It's very easy to throw out that we want ethical leaders, we want moral leaders, but what are the nuts and bolts of creating that kind of leadership? And of course, I ask you this question because you're a leader in the faith community. You deal with personal development and the development of character, and I think then you'd be well placed. But before you answer that question, I just want to invite our viewers to be sending their comments. There's a live chat, and we will be coming to your comments and coming to your questions. But Reverend Pillage, please go ahead and try and answer that for us.
I think one of the things that I mentioned is the issue of servant leadership. And I think that's a wonderful religious concept. I would not just assign it only to the Christian faith, but even to other religions as well. And the task of that leadership is to actually not be there for self-gain. And I think motivation in leadership is one of the crucial points that we need to actually dissect. Why am I in this? Am I in this for myself, or am I in this to create a better world for everybody else? And I think those are the crucial motivational points that we need to begin with, and the questions that we need to ask when we engage leadership. And I think we had that I think we had that in the liberation movement in this country in the days of apartheid. I think we had people who said justice must be part of that composition. Working for peace and reconciliation must be part of that composition. Trying to create and build rather than destroy must be part of that composition. And caring for the interest of others must be a central factor in all of that. So I think that's part of the anatomy that you described. If leaders are not there with those kind of characteristics in mind and those kind of motivation in mind, then it is already a recipe for self-destruction, but also for country destruction. And that's precisely what we are facing in our land today. The people who have started out well have suddenly jumped on the gravy trains. And the vision of actually wanting to create a better land for everybody, having come from the apartheid experience, has suddenly gone out the door because all I'm focusing on is self-gain and enrichment. And unfortunately, that is destroying our land. So to get back to your question, we need to put the interest of others first. We need to put the interest of the country first, and not even party politics at it. Not even the own party majority, whether it is whatever in terms of the ruling party. Put the interest of the nation first. Develop it. So we need leaders with courage. If you ask what kind of leaders we need today, we need leaders with courage. We unfortunately, in our past situation, we've had former leaders who have had courage to do all the wrong things. Today, we have the need for our current leaders to do all the right things. The right things not for themselves, but for building reconciliation, for encompassing and embracing diversity, and for creating a better country for all. So those are part and parcel to the dynamics that we need in leaders today. And that will give us ethical, moral leadership that actually then carries through into the rest of building a nation together. So that's the kind of anatomy that we have, that we should be looking for in leaders today.
Thank you, Reverend Pillage. Of course, I mean, individual leaders are not created in a vacuum. They don't exist in a vacuum. They are made within a particular context, within a society. And I want to just go to Professor De Visser and ask, I mean, what are the structural underpinnings of ethical and effective leadership? What kinds of institutions or what kind of institutional framework needs to be in place, not only to just produce this kind of leadership, but to sustain it? You know, and we're talking at all levels. We're talking at the family level, at the community level, because that is where individuals are brought up. So when we can talk about the individual qualities, the courage, the commitment to justice, the caring, but that is nurtured within a particular societal structure and within an institutional framework. So what kind of institutional framework do we need, Professor De Visser?
Thanks. I think it's such an important question, and I think Jerry is so right when he talks about you know, how he views leadership, because I think we sometimes oversimplify it, and we sometimes sort of look at leaders that have misbehaved, and we look at them as those monsters out there, and we must change those monsters into angels. And at the same time, you know, the context matters. And we sometimes look at these leaders and we should actually wonder, what happened? Where did you turn off? What went wrong? What was the contextual circumstances that led you to go astray? We have a lot of institutional mechanisms that will assist us in correcting that behavior, and you can talk about that. But I do want to sort of focus on I think what Hannah Arendt called the banality of evil, how actually we sometimes overlook how someone like Eichmann was actually a good and dutiful civil servant, but turned into a monster. So what happened, and what are the machinations that turn people into doing these wrong things? And I think, to give you one example, I'm talking about these councillor positions that are now going to be elected for either in October or later. Those are about 9,000 well-paid jobs. And we are living in a country with a sea of poverty and grinding unemployment. And these are well-paid jobs. Even a part-time councillor earns a salary that for many, many South Africans is completely unattainable. So that's the context within which people fight for these positions, hold on to it, and do whatever is at their disposal to maintain those positions and leverage it. So we also need to look at the context. What turns people into these monsters that we see doing those wrong things? A few quick remarks on the institutions. I think I want to say a few things about what we should not do about fixing local government, so to speak. Let's not think that centralization is the answer. There's a lot of talk about national government must take over, take back functions, etc. That's not an answer, because we are then working on an assumption that as you move up into government, higher up the levels of government, people suddenly become smarter and more honest. It's not true. And the Zondo Commission is showing us that is not true. So centralization is not the answer. Self-help, depoliticization, and privatizing local government is also not the answer. There's a lot of fantastic initiatives where people are coming together and taking over local government assets almost and fixing pipes themselves and pumps. And those are wonderful initiatives, but they are not the long-term solution. Local government is not just about pipes and sewerage and infrastructure. It is about public resources and about making decisions about that. So that needs a political system. And local government needs to partner with citizens, and we should not privatize local government services. We also need to not throw more law at it. Government is over-regulated already, certainly local government, and all those laws did not stop the bad guys, but they are certainly stopping a lot of good guys from getting things done. So more law is not the solution. And also no large-scale institutional reforms. Government is very good at coming up with new policy papers on what do we need to reform and amalgamate and overhaul. There's two reasons why those things won't work. I think one, the state in its current state is not capable of driving successful reforms that are large-scale. And secondly, they don't work. They don't deal with the root cause of leadership, which I think is why this discussion is so important. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Prof. Defissa. There's something that you mentioned that is quite crucial. You talk about the stakes being very high, given the socioeconomic context of our country. I mean, we've spoken extensively about poverty and inequality in the previous dialogue, and I'm not going to get into those issues now. And so in that context, where there's this competition, not only a competition of ideas in the democratic marketplace, but there's competition for resources. People want to feed their families. People want to sustain their lifestyles. How do we inculcate a culture of accountability? And this is to Professor Madonsela. In this context, how do we inculcate the culture of accountability? How can we nurture the personal courage it takes for individuals to speak out against ethical and ineffective leaders, particularly in a context where they might lose a lot? There's a lot to lose by standing up sometimes, because you're actually standing up against a whole system and a whole network that you might actually be benefiting from, particularly when we talk about grassroots levels and local government level. And I think this question is quite apt to give to you, because you're one of the people in our country that showed that kind of personal courage during your tenure as the public protector. Could you please assist us with thoughts around that?
Thank you. To nurture a culture of accountability starts with firstly selecting people who are accountable. If you want people to lead civil society, you want people to lead government, you've got to look at their track record. Have they displayed steward kind of leadership, as Reverend Pillage advises? I always say that leadership, as we understand it, is about influencing and inspiring yourself and others to act in a desired way. And if previously you haven't led, you won't lead when you have an office or a position. What also is true is that if you have led badly without office, it's going to be worse when you have office. So we have to start by just making sure we select the right people. The second part is nurturing. A lot of people that go into office, whether it's civil society or in government, go with good intentions, as Reverend Pillage says, but then things go wrong, and it's not always that they're evil. It just starts with need. For everyone who goes into wrongdoing, it starts with need. I think psychologists and neuroscientists would say that our behavior is motivated by pain avoidance and the search for joy, or the search for pleasure. And so the average person in an organization wants to belong. Want to avoid the pain of isolation and the pain of being possibly kicked out and not being able to feed their family. And they're going to get involved in wrongdoing, sometimes just purely out of need, temporary financial need, and then they get caught up. The third thing, so it's about that, again, make sure that people are nurtured, they are taught about ethics. The third thing is recognition. We're always talking a lot about what goes wrong. Rarely do we mention, for example, when people speak about the state, they say these people are incompetent and they are thieves. That's not true. The government would have collapsed long ago if the majority of people in government are incompetent and are thieves. The majority of people are competent and they're not thieves, they're not corrupt. How do we make sure, though, that we highlight those people that do the right thing? Because that's, I think it's Seneca who talks about what motivates people is really moving towards something good as opposed to mostly running away from what they don't like. And they did an experiment where they showed a hospital where people didn't wash hands. And it turned out that the people who didn't wash hands was almost like corruption in government, that was mostly the people at the top. So the people who are supposed to make sure that people are washing hands were the ones who were not washing hands. And punitive measures were not working because the people who are supposed to apply punitive measures were deep with their sticky hands with debt. And what happened was then they came up with a system where they were rewarded by being highlighted. So there was this board that would say Team A this week was had done 90% of hygiene, and then as a total team, this is what we achieved. And I think we need to start doing that, recognition. And then, of course, regulation. We do need the law. The fact that, if you look at what has happened in Gauteng, part of the reason things went wrong was there isn't adequate regulation. And what we're proposing from the Ecumenical Foundation is we need to leverage technology. I work at Stellenbosch University. There's certain things you can't do because the system won't let you do it. So technology has been leveraged to say, to get to the point where you can start a pilot in Swartland, which we wanted to do, you have got 15 hurdles to cross. And you can't move to hurdle 2 if you haven't crossed hurdle 1. And the system just won't let you. And if you lie to the system, then of course that's fraud, and that fraud can be detected. The third one after regulation is obviously accountability. We can't avoid accountability. We have to make sure that there is consequences. People are made answerable, and they're made to take responsibility. And it's not always about going to jail. It's often about just making sure that they acknowledge what they did, and if they took away money, they put the money back. The last one, though, which I would like to pose to our colleagues here, is rehabilitation. In a society where somebody who did something 19 years ago is not allowed to get back into the system. Dina Pule, for example, is the only person during my term as a public protector who resigned on own accord. My report simply said, we recommend, because as public protector, you have a power to order or to recommend. We recommended that she resigns because she had lied to Parliament and we had caught her lying. And then she resigned. Now they're trying to put her back into the system. The world says we should keep them out. By keeping people out of the system all the time, we are creating a society of corrupt people, because then the only way people who have been kicked out of the system are going to survive is to gravitate to people who don't mind the fact that they have a bad track record. What we need to do is to look at how do we rehabilitate people so that there are second chances and there's an opportunity for leaders to make mistakes, but to acknowledge those mistakes and become leaders. I mean, if you look at Siemens, the company, it was caught in a big corruption scandal, but today it's a leader in the UN Global Compact in telling us what goes wrong in corruption and how does it affect the citizens of the company, but how does it affect the whole world, and what can we do to stop it? Thank you.
Thank you, Prof. Madonsela. I think you echo the sentiments shared by Prof. De Visser earlier. When you talk about need. People don't just turn bad. There's a reason why people become bad apples in the system. And you also echoed the point about sometimes the system is itself a challenge. The regulations themselves are a barrier. And I think a question that then comes to mind is, then how do we solve that? How do we align, and produce ethical leaders in the context where need might drive them to the direction of immorality or unethical behavior, and what do we do about the regulations? What do we do about the systemic challenges that competent people who are committed to changing society for the better face when they're trying to do the right thing? I'm going to give it to Prof. De Visser just to share some thoughts, and then we can go to Reverend Pillage as well.
Well, let me just make a short input, following on to what you're saying. And I think Professor Madonsela's point is crucial about this the servant leadership and accountability. And I think the one important distinction that we don't often make is that accountability, when it comes to political accountability, is not always the same as guilt. There is also this concept of I'm at the top. I'm in charge and the buck stops with me. And things may have happened in my organization that I was perhaps not even aware of, or that I wasn't party to, or that I'm not necessarily individually guilty as my individual personality. But you know what? This is my organization, and I step down, or I accept responsibility. I accept accountability. And we don't see that. Political leaders will hold on for as long as they can, and they will apportion blame to others around them, their administration or their colleagues. Because if we stop doing that, and if we also accept accountability in that way, it's also much easier to then accept that person can then also come back and can be rehabilitated, because there is no shame in taking responsibility and taking accountability for something that has gone wrong in your organization. So maybe that's some small contribution that I can make. Thanks, Nompumelelo.
Thank you so much, Prof. De Visser. I think it's so important, the point you're making about accountability, because accountability is a neutral word. It's not a negative word. It's not a positive word. It's about being answerable. You're in a position of responsibility, and so you are answerable for what happens under your leadership, under your administration. And I think even in the context where leaders are doing well, something that Prof. Madonsela mentioned is that we don't highlight those that are doing well. It's because we've got this negative concept about accountability. We can bring those doing well to come and ask them questions. How is it possible that you're succeeding? What are you doing right? What can be done better? That's what accountability is about. And I think it's really about building that line of communication between those who lead us and those who are led. And it goes back to the concept of servant leadership and how it should play out. Reverend Pillage, again, just on that concept, how can servant leadership play out at a political level?
Well, let's face it. The truth is that the best of people can be tempted in an environment of opportunity, and when structures actually avail that makes that enticing. And that's a reality. So people go in with good intentions, and they want to do the best, and they want to be the ethical leaders that we're asking for. But when they see corruption, and when they see everybody benefits from corruption, temptation falls in the way too. So yes, we've got to change the structures, firstly, to make sure that temptation is not actually prevalent in those environments. And we've got to find the loopholes and the gaps that create these kind of opportunities for mischief, and ask, what are these, and how do we address them, and how do we make it become less tempting for people to put themselves into these kind of situations. But also the key, and let's not take this away from anybody, the key is also the individual response. You may have an environment that is not conducive and that is tempting to do corrupt things, but it is the individual responsibility to say, listen, I see what I see, but I'm not prepared to go there. And that's what servant leadership is all about. He's putting before you that which I will say God calls for, that which is right in terms of building society, that which speaks of justice, that which does not speak of exploitation and oppression and self-benefit. So I must make that conscious decision, even in a tempting environment. Now, let's not say that's not possible, because there are people who have been doing this. There are people who have stood up, and there are people who have been counted for standing up for moral issues and levels. We're talking about some incidents now in South Africa. I just heard a little debate last night about the assistant coach in the cricket team having resigned. And there are people who are saying some good things about this guy. He has thrown away a possible career of becoming the coach, but because he decided to stand up for what he believes is correct. So what I'm saying is that individuals must make a choice. Individuals must say, I will follow what it means to be a servant rather than to actually grab what everybody else wants to grab. So there's a bit of both. And I want to agree with regards to the issue of rehabilitation. I think coming from a religious perspective, the whole aspect of forgiveness is important. The idea of restitution is important. The idea of reintegrating people back into society once they have fallen is important, and we must not lose sight of those things. So that is very important. But in the same breath, we must continue to ask, are we not putting them into situations and structures where they continue to be tempted? So if temptation becomes the lead, then we must be careful and calculated in what we do and where we put people. But forgiveness and rehabilitation is important, because in fact, if that is what we choose to do, then that are signs and efforts and initiatives in creating a better world, where we can also make people become better people, which they desire to be. And I really like to think that they desire to be. And how do we actually create those opportunities? Let's not label people off, and let's not write them off completely. Let's not see them in bad judgment. Let's understand that there are multiple factors that turn people into what they do that is incorrect or corrupt. But let's ask, how can we assist them, and how can we assist society to actually walk towards a better world for everybody?
So I'm seeing an interesting thread developing here, but of course, you know, being a social scientist, there's a structure agency debate. I see here the importance of the individual making choices, individual value system that, of course, will be developed in childhood within the family setting, community setting, etc. But then there are also structural influences as well. I mean, we live in a country, we've already mentioned, where the temptations abound because people are needy. Lots and lots of people face very difficult circumstances and hardship, and we saw this during the looting, the rioting in the last couple of weeks that took place in Gauteng and KZN, where when you go down to some of the personal stories of those people who were involved, who found themselves involved, is that point about temptation, tempted because there's a need and an opportunity, and so it seems that there is a relationship between the structural reforms that need to be made in our economy, that needs to be made in our politics, that needs to be made broadly in our society to make it more inclusive, more just, as Prof. Madonsela spoke about earlier, those constitutional principles and that commitment to human rights, versus inculcating the courage within people to commit to a particular value system. And I'm going to turn my attention to the comments from our viewers and some of the questions that they've raised. There are quite a number. I'm going to try and scroll through them very quickly. We got a comment from Graham who says, there are laws in this country and both citizens and government must adhere to those laws. All signs of corruption must be rooted out and the corrupt punished. Okay, I think that point has been made. And then Joshua says, such a relevant and important discussion, given where we are as a country, and what a privilege to hear from these esteemed thought leaders. That's to you, the panelists. And then Putela says, the current government is suffering from a savior complex. During the transition from the old to the new ANC, the ANC is exactly what the country needed at that time, but going forward, change in mindset geared towards growth is required. If you analyze the wording used during election campaigns, you can't blame voters for having expectations. But the unfortunate reality is that the current situation is simply not sustainable. Okay, that's a comment. There's a question from SGM. He or she says, my greatest concern has always been protection of whistleblowers. We have great policies and laws in South Africa. To the panelists, what else needs to be done to protect and retain whistleblowers' dignity and continue to hold looters accountable? I just want you all to take note of that one, and then I'm going to continue reading. There's something from Abe Mkize, a comment. He says South Africa needs a direct democracy, and political party system seems to not be effective. We can't deal properly with the current voter apathy until people are in a position to elect their leaders directly. The recent by-elections realized on less than 20% voter turnout. And when we go for the national elections, there would be less than 5 million voters. So Kiza is actually referring to the voter turnout and implications for support of the political system. I think it goes to the point that Prof. Madonsela made earlier about democracy being malleable, and something that we can actually mold and shape. And so it's the way we are presenting it, this debate about the kind of electoral system, etc. And then this is from Omri Mahuale, excuse me for that. If we can have compulsory lifestyle audits for all civil servants and politicians, we can prevent some of the crooks assuming political office. And then let me look and see if there are any other. And then something from Christian Endres. He says, dear Prof. Professor, good government design is designed not for the capable and virtuous leaders, but to work even if leaders are incapable. Cynical. He says this is cynical. How does South Africa's local government design measure up to that concept? I hope you got that, Prof. Professor. And then from Polisile, cadre deployment is so anti-democratic and might lead to apathy against public participation and inclusion of stakeholders. Something here from Sipo. I also think grassroots governance and accountability, as well as ethical leadership, begins at home where nurturing begins. Family values are so crucial in building up a good community. Most leaders we have belong to our religious groups and churches. The church, therefore, has a crucial role to play in strengthening these values. In South Africa, we lack virtuous leaders, people with integrity. I'm going to give that one to you, Reverend Pillage, because the question did come up last week as well. Somebody saying that most South Africans would consider themselves Christian, about 70 to 80% when they're, given a survey or whatever. And so the question was, then why aren't we seeing those Christian values across the spectrum of leadership in our society? Then there's something from Willie M. I do question the present position where local government councillors are elected as nominated by political parties. The nominated councillors are only accountable to the party. The country is desperate for a situation where councillors are directly elected by stakeholders. Prof. Madonsela, I'm going to ask you to just speak to that point. I think it's something that Prof. Professor has touched on. And then something from Martin Engelbrecht, a question. Do we need a comprehensive system of continual auditing of our political leaders? I think that's related to the audits, personal audits, and then something from Believer in Ethics. I do not believe that a myriad of small political parties, all with opposing political views, can manage to remove the ANC from government. It is the ANC which needs to reform its entire constitution, removing the CADA committee and governing for the benefit of South Africa and not for the sustenance of the ANC. So this person is saying we need the reform of the governing party rather than the reform of the political system. And then there's a question from Putela who says, if mineral resources were removed from the equation, is South Africa technically a destitute country? Before the discovery of diamonds and gold in the early 1800s, South Africa's economic performance globally was poor, and a high level of administration was required to optimize on available resources. 100 years from now, when mineral resources will potentially be too deep to mine, what type of government is required to steer the country towards economic sustainability? I'm going to give that one to Prof. Defissa. And then Anthony Silva says, good morning. It is apparent that the panel does not grasp the real problem in South Africa. Okay, let's see what he says. We have an administration and management problem rather than failed leadership. Okay, just as the Roman Empire needed only one leader, Julius Caesar, but needed tens of thousands of consuls throughout the empire to administer the laws and collect the taxes. The question is, how do we develop and deploy people to run and administer all facets rather than try to lead? Let us follow one leader like Mao or Gandhi and get South Africa working. I think for me, my interpretation of this comment into a question would be, what's the difference between leadership and governance? And how are the two linked? And how do they speak to each other? Perhaps Prof. Madonsela, you can handle that one. And then a question for Prof. Madonsela. I love the concept of recognizing good leadership and governance. Is there a practical mechanism to A, quantify or measure good governance, and B, incentivize or reward it? So those are pretty much all our comments. Okay, there's one I missed, a question from Teboho Tepe, who says, why is it that those who are corrupt or corruptible are often the ones who move up the leadership ladder? Why is it that those who are corrupt or corruptible are often the ones who move up the leadership ladder? Prof. Defissa, if you can take that one from Tepo. So we've got about 10 minutes to go. I'm going to allow us to answer the questions that I've allocated. I'll begin with Prof. Defissa, if you can cover the questions that I've given you, and then we'll go to Prof. Madonsela and then to Reverend Pillage.
Thank you, Nompumelelo. I'll try my very best, but forgive me if I may not be able to address them all fully and do justice to it, because there's so many valuable comments and questions being made. A quick one, I think, bringing Tebogo's question and Christian's questions together on good governance and how it works when things go wrong, and why do those that are corrupt move up? And I want to respond to that with, I think that the problem is that we have politicized consequence management. Whether or not you face consequences for bad behavior is too dependent on politics. For example, how can it be, turning to the local government system, how can it be that a municipality can pick up a disclaimer after disclaimer after disclaimer year on year on year, which means your finances are in a mess and you are most probably stealing, but nobody's doing anything about it. There is no intervention. We have an intervention system. Government can intervene into a municipality and take over when things go wrong, but it doesn't happen even when there is such clear objective signs. Another example is I think probably in the last 20 years, we've seen about, I think not more than 20 convictions for financial malperformance in local government, and that against a sea of corruption that we see and hear reported on. So there's a problem with consequence management. I want to pick up on the question of the ANC, and I think it's important. And somebody put it on the table, and I think it's important because we cannot talk as if the ANC doesn't exist. We cannot talk that we can wish the ANC away. It's there. It's the ruling party, and it has serious problems. Again, talking about local government, there are municipalities in the Eastern Cape and in the Northwest that have managed to elect 2 mayors and appointed 2 municipal managers, because the two factions of the ANC are so at war with each other and have captured governance and elections that there are now municipalities with 2 mayors and 2 municipal managers, and both municipal managers have access to the bank account. Now, those problems are deeply political and vest within the ruling party. And frankly, the ruling party must get its act together and must stop allowing its factional fights to spill over into administration and paralyze service delivery. And that's a very real, urgent, current problem. And it's not an anti-ANC statement, but it is a statement that really relates to the current problems within the ruling party, which, accept it or not, is such an important force in our society. And if that doesn't get addressed, or it's turned around at elections, as Songezo Zibi said, we must vote the ANC out. We cannot press the same button at elections every time and accept a different result. So of course, that's the accountability angle to it. But either way, there's problems with the ruling party that needs to be addressed because it spills over into administration and causes pain and suffering. Thanks, Nompumelelo.
Professor, just to follow up, you mentioned the problem of financial management at municipal level and consequence management being politicized. What is your view on the additional powers now given to the Auditor General that can now investigate the causes for, financial mismanagement and, the defaults and the bad audits, etc. Do you think that's going to make a difference with regards to consequence management? If it's the Auditor General that can now give remedial actions, recommend remedial actions?
It will make a difference, but it will not go all the way. All these reforms are important, and it's an important new step in the direction of more accountability. But we cannot place the onus on the Auditor General to fix local government. And the Auditor General will move cautiously with this, because those are very serious recommendations that are made compulsory by the Auditor General and can result in individual liability of officials. But where that's needed, that must be done. And it will certainly have a deterrent effect for many in local government. But I think we also need stronger capability within our police and our NPA to actually prosecute and get convictions, because that's still another part of consequence management that is not happening sufficiently, certainly not in local government, where we don't have enough capability and wherewithal, frankly, within our criminal justice system to put some of those people that commit wrongdoing, actually have them criminally convicted. But certainly I think it will help. One last note on is it also sometimes has a paralyzing effect, where municipal officials become so scared of the prospect of being caught into this that they become very reserved and are not able to take decisions, are not able to sometimes take the right decisions that they want to take, because they're so afraid of the tyranny of the Auditor General. So that's another angle to it. But on the whole, I support it, but I don't think it will take us all the way. Okay.
I'd like to ask you another question just quickly. I mean, and then your views on catered deployment, because that's, at local government level, you find somebody who made a mess in one municipality, a year later they're in another municipality holding a position of power again, of course, because the party has been able to deploy them there. I mean, you talked about the ANC having to get its act together, but what's your view on this matter of catered deployment? It was raised in one of the comments.
Well, I've got a very specific response to that in relation to local government. Of course, it's a big debate that we must have. But in the context of local government, what we have done with local government administrators, we have made the appointment of local government administrators very much state-led. In the past, there was a system where every town clerk and every chief financial officer belonged to an association, almost like doctors and lawyers. And if you misbehaved, or if you didn't keep up with your training, the association would chuck you out, just like the lawyers and the doctors do. If you don't keep up your accreditation, you're out, you get disbarred. We had that system. It was obviously used to keep out Black people. So it was ditched, correctly so, because it was used to keep Black people out of the system. But maybe we threw the baby away with the bathwater, because now we have a system that completely relies on political decision-making to decide who gets appointed where and when. And I think that has led us, through catered deployment, to where we are now. So we need to seriously think about also allowing self-regulation and associations to protect the integrity and quality of administrative leadership.
Thank you, Prof. Duffiso. This is an important point around the professionalization, this talk about the professionalization of the public administration, important, crucial point. Prof. Madonsela, let me come to you. Please unmute.
Thank you, Nompumelelo. On the question about direct elections for local government and national, instead of people being elected through political parties, we do have some of that in local government. You note, for example, that the IEC reported that this year we had a much higher number of nominations for consideration to be voted into local government positions. It's because in local government, we've always had an opportunity for independence and for partyless. At national level, we do not have that yet. And the case from the New Nation and My Vote Counts has opened up that possibility, and Parliament is currently working to make sure that we can have more independent people applying for these positions. Even those that come from partyless, we still have to elect them as individuals, the ward councillors, which means we need to educate people to understand that there are people who are going to be elected on a party ticket. There are those that we have to elect on the basis of their competence. And that's part of our everyday justice training for people to know, because a lot of people don't know that. And somebody mentioned that there is voter apathy. That's true that people are apathetic when it comes to voting, but they're not apathetic when it comes to democracy. They just feel that the system as it is rigged against them, and hence then they resort to riots and things like that. On the question of what is the best system of what is good governance, the UN has defined good governance, and I'm glad somebody asked this question because we often confuse clean governance and good governance. Where there's good governance, the Gini coefficient can't increase. And as it stands, there's no municipality in this country that can claim that it is adhering to good governance. There are many municipalities that are adhering to clean governance, but they're not adhering to good governance because we need to see at municipal level the beginning of compliance with the constitutional commitment to establish a society that is founded on democratic values, social justice, and fundamental human rights. So that kind of government, according to the UN, that will be able to do those things is one that adheres to 8 good governance principles. The first one is it is participatory. So when you're looking at participation, again, make sure that you disaggregate your people and no one is left behind. Both poor, rich, black, white, young and old should be able to participate. A lot of these meetings are convened during the day when many people are at work, and then government comes back and say people agreed, but it was only poor, unemployed people that agreed. Consistent with the rule of law, that speaks for itself. Transparent, we're supposed to be a transparent democracy, and if we were adhering to open governance fully, a lot of the scandals and the lack of trust that emerges from it would not be happening. Responsive, that speaks for itself. And at Stellenbosch University, we've come up with a tool that is called SIAM, a social justice impact assessment matrix, because if you're responsive, you've got to disaggregate the people that you want to serve so that you can look at, will this policy respond meaningfully to the circumstances of each community? And we saw that with the COVID-19 regulations. They were not disaggregated, or the planning and design did not disaggregate the community out there into various groups. I mean, in companies, when they plan services, they ask themselves, who's going to buy this thing? And they disaggregate the world into different classes, and government needs to do the same. A consensus-oriented, we've become very polarized. The land question is one of those examples we need to look for. Is there room for consensus building, which is we all need to understand where are we going and what are the various options for going there. The sixth one is equitable and inclusive. That's clearly a social justice question. Is this way we are governing including people? I mean, we look at some of the very well-functioning municipalities, but the gap between the rich and poor is growing. So that is not good governance. Effective and efficient, that speaks for itself. And lastly, accountable. And you mentioned that accountability is about answerability. We also say it's about answerability and taking responsibility. In other words, fix what you messed up. And there's various ways of fixing it. It's not always about sending someone to jail, but it's also about placing people as close as possible to where they would have been. Just in ending, to get to the point that you mentioned, Nompumelelo, to say, for good governance to happen, for great leadership to happen, you need a balance between agency and structure. And I think that's what we think at the Ecumenical Foundation, that at the level of the individual, you need to make sure that people are trained to understand that they are there as servants of the people, whether they are governing in civil society or they're governing in the public sector. They're there to serve the people. The UN Global Compact is taking that even to companies, to say you are there to serve the people and to protect the environment. And that's how we've come up with these principles of epic leadership that emerged during my term as public protector, when we saw what kinds of institutions survive and are sustainable, and they consistently perform admirably, and there is trust inside the institution, and there's trust between the institution and broader society. And those are institutions that are led by persons who are taking responsibility for being ethical. In other words, doing things in a principled way, purpose-driven, reconciling everything they do with the purpose of the organization and the purpose of the power they've been given. Impact conscious, always aware what's going to be the impact now on my team, impact on society, impact on the environment, and of course committed to serve, which is about servant leadership, because every leader exercises borrowed power or entrusted power, and it's important that power is used in a manner that serves everyone, not just people like you, which we refer to as just us, serving people like you. And this can be taught. We've shown at Tuma that this can be taught. Young people who used to be fiery, who used to resort to rioting to get their point across, are becoming upright leaders who are taking responsibility for their own actions as they try to move society forward. But the structure then also itself should contain. If you look at the South African Constitution, it balances the two, structure and agency. At the level of structure, Section 195 is very clear what kind of society are we supposed to be governed as. Section 96 is clear about what the executive should comply with in terms of ethics, in Section 136. But it then also provides the vision of society that we have to go for. So at the level of a person, it is Section 195 and some aspects of Section 195 and Section 96. And then the broader Constitution itself provides a framework that honestly covers all of the 8 UN good governance principles. And if we were adhering to them and only electing people who have exhibited these principles, we could move forward.
Thank you, Prof. Madonsela. Reverend Pillage?
Thank you. Yes, of course, I fully agree that ethical values and moral training and teaching starts at home. I think that's the first priority, because the role of parents and siblings and peers are crucial and critical to nurture individuals, and that is how they will respond. You mentioned about South Africa as 70% Christians. If we added other people of other faiths and the numbers would be much more higher. But let's understand also that religious people live in a real world. And the real world is a world of temptation, is a world of greed, is a world of, in as much as there's so much of good and great people doing wonderful and godly things, yet we are enticed and attracted to some of these temptations in a negative way. But also you mentioned about churches, and I think the churches are important, and they've got a very crucial role to play in nurturing biblical religious values and instilling them in people. But remember too that churches have actually, unfortunately, missed the boat. Churches that are advocating the prosperity gospel and thriving on materialism, and we are telling people that they must get rich, and wealth and prosperity is the way to go if we want to see God's blessings and know that we are blessed. And I think those things are seriously questionable. And that actually then also impacts on how people behave and how people learn and how people want to trump other people to get to the top. And so it leads to a corrupt society. Compulsory audit lifestyles, I think that is very, very important. I think the government actually for some years was trying to actually speak about that, and they started off and they made public what they were doing about these things with the ministers, for example, and there still is obviously the tendency for that. But unfortunately, and I'll say quite courageously, we have a system of leaders at the moment and a system of leadership that protects corruption and protects the corrupt. And therefore, the lifestyle audit has gone out the window. So we need to bring that back, and we need to be meticulous and careful in implementing these policies. I want to say one more thing about the voter apathy. I think that is absolutely true in terms of what was told. But I also want to raise the point of the voters are traumatized. When it comes to election, they're traumatized. They don't know who to vote for. They have relied on a party from the past, and the party is letting them down. We must actually explore and interrogate what voter trauma, the trauma that voters actually engage and feel these days. It's a very serious point for discussion. I can speak for myself in that instance. Voting is a very difficult thing. When you've been in the past and when you've worked with things in the past and you've supported certain parties in the past, you ask the question now, can I support them in the future and in the present? It's a traumatizing experience. So we need to understand that apathy comes from that too. I will always vote, but I think that people are actually complacent now because they've lost touch and they've lost the desire to actually participate in these elections. I want to end on one last note because nobody else has spoken to it directly. The person who spoke about the dichotomy between administration and management and failed leaders. No matter how good systems and structures you may have in place, let's not forget you need good people and leaders to make them work. So you cannot actually separate them both. All the good systems work, but if good people are not working within the systems and not working it well, then it's a recipe for disaster. And that's precisely what we've been seeing in some of the places of the municipalities, in local and regional government levels, and even on a national level. You need good people to make good structures to work, and that's what good governance is all about. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Rev Pillage. Thank you so much for those thoughtful and insightful reflections at the end of our discussion. I just want to sum it all up to say that what came out of this discussion is that it is important that we consider what we need to do when we talk about the professionalization of the public administration. Professor De made that point very clearly and strongly. I think the second thing is the need for civic and political education. And I think Professor Madonsela has spoken a lot to that, especially in the work that she's doing right now at the University of Stellenbosch. And when we unpack that a little bit is to say, how do we advise, educate, and engage with young people, engage with communities about what it is that they should look for when they are voting? How it is that they should go about exercising their power and their agency when they're interacting and engaging in the democratic process. And then the other thing that really stood out as well, is coming out very strongly, is the need to promote good governance, the principles of which are already embedded within our constitution. And this concept of steward leadership and servant leadership having to go hand in hand with that institutional and structural framework around good governance. And then the commitment to constitutional values and constitutional principles, the kind of society that we're trying to construct. And the fact that if we have all these things in place, if we have good governance in place, if we have steward leadership and servant leadership in place, if we have a public that is confident in participating in these processes, if we have a professional public administration, it will lead to lower inequality and it will improve our poverty indicators in the country. It will lead us towards the direction of that socially cohesive society that we're trying to build. I just want to take this opportunity to thank our viewers for joining us this morning for this very important discussion. Thank you for the comments. Thank you for participating. I want to thank our panelists, Reverend Pillage, Professor Madonsela, Professor Tefisa. Thank you for sharing your insights and reflections. And thank you once again to Business Day Dialogues Live in association with the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung and the Ecumenical Foundation of Southern Africa. And we look forward to continuing this discussion. I hope it can continue as we separate, as we part in our different places, so that we all can contribute to building the society that we want to see. From me, Nompumelelo Runji, your MC, signing off and wishing you a very good day further.